Come sit a spell. The day's heat is fading, and the desert's telling its stories. Most tales you hear from the Old West are about men. Men with fast guns, hard fists, and iron wills. They're good stories, to be sure. But tonight, I want to tell you a different kind of story. One about a power that was quieter, but no less fierce. A story about a woman who stood up when all the strong men had knelt down. It's the tale of a town called Sagebrush, and the lioness who taught it how to roar. The town of Sagebrush was a speck of stubborn life in the vast, arid canvas of the American West. It existed in a state of delicate and spoken balance. The sun was the undisputed king, ruling the sky with a merciless glare. The land was the queen, vast and beautiful but withholding, demanding tribute in sweat and blood for every bushel of corn and head of cattle it yielded. And the town itself was a patriarchy, a small but rigid kingdom ruled by men. Power was measured in the acres a man owned, the number of cattle he branded, or the speed with which he could draw the colt on his hip. The council was made of men, the sheriff was a man, and the laws, written and unwritten, were designed to be understood and upheld by men. Women were the silent, sturdy pillars that held up this world. They ran the homes, raised the children, and tended the sick, but they were pillars, not architects. This was the world Margaret Fallon, known to all as Maggie, had been born into. And now, at the age of 22, it was a world she was set to inherit. Her father, John Fallon, had been a giant of a man, both in stature and in spirit. He had carved the crossstaff ranch out of the wilderness with his bare hands and a will of iron. He was a man's man, respected, feared, and admired. He had taught his only child, Maggie, not how to sew and bake, but how to read a land deed, how to set a broken bone on a calf, how to track a cougar, and, in the quiet evenings, how to play a shrewd game of chess. "The world is a chessboard, Maggie girl," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "Doesn't matter if you're a king or a pawn. What matters is seeing the whole board." 2 weeks ago, a runaway wagon and a freak accident had taken John Fallon's life, leaving Maggie an orphan and the sole heir to the largest and most prosperous ranch in the territory. The town of Sagebrush held its breath, and a married woman, a girl really, in charge of the crossstaff. It was unthinkable. It was a violation of the natural order of things. The common wisdom, spoken over beers in the saloon and agreed upon with solemn nods by the town council, was that she would be forced to sell. Or, more likely, a suitable husband, perhaps the ambitious son of a neighboring rancher or the town's calculating banker, would step in to help her manage her affairs, and incidentally, her fortune. Maggie Fallon, however, was not interested in the town's wisdom. The day after her father's funeral, she rode into town. She was not a large woman, but she sat her horse with a straight-back confidence that made her seem taller. Her auburn hair was tied back in a practical braid, and her face, dusted with freckles from the sun, was set in an expression of calm, unshakable resolve. Her eyes, the color of mossy green stones, missed nothing. She didn't ride to the church to pray or to the mercantile for supplies. She rode directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a good man, but a tired one. He was a man who believed in keeping the peace by disturbing it as little as possible. He was in his office, nursing a cup of coffee, when Maggie walked in. She did not look like a grieving daughter. She looked like a businesswoman. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and direct, without any hint of feminine deference. "I'm here to file the official transfer of the crossstaff brand and land deeds into my name. As per my father's legally certified will." She placed a formidable stack of documents, tied with a lawyer's ribbon, on his desk. Sheriff Brody blinked, taken aback. "Maggie, are you sure you're up to this? Running a spread that size? It's a man's work. A hard man's work." "My father taught me the work, Sheriff. He didn't specify what gender it was for," she replied coolly. "I just need your official stamp. The law is the law, isn't it?" Her directness, her refusal to play the part of the helpless maiden, flustered him. He reluctantly stamped the papers, making her the official, legal owner of the most powerful ranch in the region. Her next stop was the bank, where she met with the town's banker, a paunchy, condescending man named Silas Croft. Croft had already prepared a portfolio of lowball offers for her land from a syndicate of investors he represented. He presented them to her with a paternalistic smile, as if doing her a great favor. "My dear Margaret, He began, "In this difficult time, the community wants to ensure your security. These gentlemen are prepared to offer you a generous sum, enough to live comfortably in a city like St. Louis for the rest of your life." Maggie looked at the papers, then up at him, her green eyes as cold and clear as a mountain lake. "Mr. Croft," she said, "the only security I'm interested in is the security of the Crossstaff Ranch. I'll be increasing my father's regular payroll by 10% for all loyal hands, effective immediately. And I'll be hiring 5 more riders before the end of the month. Please ensure the bank is prepared to honor my drafts." She stood up, leaving the portfolio of offers and touched on his desk. "My father always said, invest in loyalty, Mr. Croft. It's the only currency that never loses its value. Good day." She left the banker sputtering in her wake, his paternalistic smile frozen into a mask of disbelief and fury. Maggie's actions sent a shockwave through the patriarchal bedrock of Sagebrush. She wasn't just refusing to be a victim, she was seizing power. She was playing the game, and she was playing it by her own rules. The men of the town council watched her with a mixture of awe and deep-seated anxiety. She was an anomaly, a disruption to their comfortable, predictable world. They didn't know it yet, but the quiet, orderly kingdom of Sagebrush was on the verge of a revolution. And the unlikely and willing queen had just claimed her throne. While Sagebrush was grappling with the internal disruption of Maggie Fallon's ascension, a far more dangerous threat was gathering on the horizon. The name was spoken only in hushed, fearful whispers: Black Wolf Dalton. He and his gang of 30 ruthless outlaws were a plague upon the territory, a pack of human predators who swept through the high desert, leaving a trail of burned-out homesteads, robbed stages, and dead men in their wake. Dalton was more than a common bandit. He was a cunning, brutal strategist with a singular, terrifying ambition. He didn't just want to rob the territory, he wanted to own it. His method was a form of scorched earth capitalism. He would terrorize a region, driving down land prices until the desperate, frightened settlers were willing to sell their holdings for pennies on the dollar to his shadowy network of land speculators. For months, the wolf pack had been circling Sagebrush, their raids growing bolder, closer. They had hit isolated ranches, run off cattle, and killed a few prospectors in the hills. These were probing attacks, designed to instill a creeping, pervasive fear. The town council, led by a blustering, indecisive cattle baron named Judge Miller, had responded with predictable inaction. They had sent a petition to the territorial marshal which had gone unanswered, formed a vigilance committee that did little more than drink whiskey and talk tough in the saloon, and publicly urged everyone to remain calm. Sheriff Brody, hampered by a lack of resources and a town council that refused to fund more deputies, was effectively powerless. He and his one deputy could police the town itself, but they could not protect the vast, open range that was its lifeblood. The shadow of Black Wolf Dalton was growing longer, and the town of Sagebrush was cowering, waiting for the inevitable attack. Maggie Fallon saw the danger with the clear-eyed pragmatism her father had taught her. While the men of the council debated and dithered, she acted. She used the new riders she'd hired not just for ranch work, but to patrol the borders of her land, creating a network of sentries. She studied maps of the territory, marking the locations of Dalton's raids, discerning a pattern in his seemingly random attacks. She saw that he wasn't just raiding, he was isolating Sagebrush, cutting it off, softening it up for the kill. The prize he was after, she realized, was not just the town's bank or its cattle. It was the land itself, and her ranch, the Crossstaff, was the jewel in the crown. Her foresight was proven correct in the most brutal way possible. The Peterson family, who owned a small homestead bordering her own, were her staunchest allies, a good, hard-working family who had refused to be intimidated. One morning, one of Maggie's patrols found their homestead. It was a smoking ruin. The house and barn had been burned to the ground. The livestock had been slaughtered in the fields. And Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, along with their 2 young sons, had been shot and left where they fell. Pinned to their front door with a bowie knife was a crude drawing of a wolf's head. It was not a raid. It was a statement, an act of terror designed to break the will of the entire community. The news of the Peterson massacre hit Sagebrush like a physical blow. The creeping fear that had been lurking at the edges of town now flooded the main street, choking the life out of it. People barred their doors. Families began to pack their wagons, ready to abandon everything they had built. The town council convened an emergency meeting, which quickly devolved into a shouting match of panic and blame. It was into this meeting that Maggie Fallon walked, uninvited. She strode into the smoke-filled room in the back of the saloon, her face pale but her expression a mask of cold, controlled fury. The dozen powerful men of Sagebrush fell silent, startled by her intrusion. "Judge Miller," Maggie said, her voice cutting through the silence, "the Peterson family is dead. Your vigilance committee was, I assume, debating the situation over a game of cards when it happened." The judge, a portly man with a face accustomed to being obeyed, sputtered, "This is a private meeting, Miss Fallon. This is men's business. The 4 bodies I saw this morning, 2 of them children, have made it my business," she shot back, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned them. "You have all sat here, fat and comfortable, while Dalton's pack has been picking us off one by one. You've sent petitions, you've made speeches, and you have done nothing. Your inaction is going to get us all killed." "And what would you have us do, girl?" another rancher sneered. "Ride out there and get ourselves slaughtered. There are 30 of them." Maggie walked to the head of the table, placing her hands flat upon it and leaning forward, her green eyes blazing with an intensity that made the men shrink back. "No," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "We are not going to ride out and meet them on their terms. We are going to make them meet us on ours. We are going to turn this town into a fortress. We are going to turn every rancher, every farmer, every shopkeeper into a soldier. And we are going to fight. We are not going to fight like a group of brave, stupid men, charging headfirst into a superior force. We are going to fight like a woman. We are going to be clever. We are going to be patient. We are going to use our minds as our primary weapon, not our guns." She looked around the table, at the stunned, incredulous faces of the most powerful men in the territory. "Black Wolf Dalton thinks we are a flock of sheep waiting for the slaughter. He has made a fatal miscalculation. He has mistaken our shepherd for a man. He is about to find out that this flock is guarded by a lioness." Her declaration hung in the air, a shocking, revolutionary statement. In that moment, the balance of power in Sagebrush shifted. It was no longer about acres, or cattle, or the speed of a man's draw. It was about the sheer, unshakable will of a woman who had just declared war. Maggie's declaration of war was met not with applause, but with a stunned, sputtering silence. The idea of a woman, a girl, dictating military strategy to the seasoned, powerful men of the territory was so far outside their realm of experience that they were momentarily speechless. But Maggie did not wait for their approval. She had seized the initiative, and she would not relinquish it. "This is not a debate," she announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. "This is a plan for survival. Those who are interested in surviving will follow me. Those who prefer to write strongly worded letters to the territorial marshal are free to stay here." She turned and strode out of the room, leaving the council to their astonishment. What followed was a subtle but profound shift in the town's social fabric. A few of the younger ranchers, men who were less entrenched in the old ways and more terrified of Dalton's wolf pack, followed her out. So did Ben Carter, the blacksmith, a quiet man whose respect was earned by deeds, not words. Slowly, reluctantly, others began to drift out of the council room and gather in the main street, drawn by the undeniable force of Maggie's certainty. By the end of the hour, she had a de facto militia, a small, disorganized, but willing group of men who were looking to her not as a woman, but as a leader. Maggie's mind, honed by years of playing chess with her father, saw the entire territory as a board. Black Wolf Dalton was the opposing king, powerful but predictable in his aggression. His riders were his knights and rooks, capable of swift, brutal attacks. The town of Sagebrush and the surrounding ranches were her own vulnerable pieces. A direct, head-on confrontation would be a fool's game, trading pawn for pawn until she was inevitably overwhelmed. Her strategy, therefore, would be one of misdirection, traps, and attrition. She would not play his game of force, she would make him play her game of wits. Her first move was to create an illusion of weakness. She knew Dalton would have scouts watching the town. So, she organized a public, panicked exodus. She had 6 families, their wagons loaded high with possessions, ride out of town in a great show of despair, heading north. The men of the town council, who had chosen to stick with their own ineffectual plans, watched this with grim satisfaction, seeing it as proof that the town was collapsing. But what Dalton's scouts didn't see was that these wagons were mostly empty, and that under the cover of darkness, the families circled back to a secure, hidden canyon a few miles from town. A prearranged redoubt that Maggie had prepared. She had created a ghost army, a reserve of fighters that Dalton would not know existed. Her second move was to fortify the town itself, but not in the way the men expected. They had spoken of building barricades and preparing for a frontal assault. Maggie saw this as a death trap. "He wants us to huddle together in the street so he can butcher us," she told her followers. Instead, she turned Sagebrush into a giant, interconnected fortress. Using her knowledge of the town's layout, she had Ben Carter and his men knock holes in the adobe walls between buildings, creating a network of interior passages. A man could now travel from the saloon to the mercantile to the hotel without ever stepping foot on the main street. She had them fortify the second-story windows, creating a crossfire zone that would turn the main street into a deadly killing field for any force that tried to ride down it. Her third, and most cunning, move was to strike at Dalton's psyche. She knew that a man who called himself Black Wolf saw himself as a predator, a creature of superior strength and cunning. She decided to play on his arrogance. She selected her two best riders and horsemen, two young, weary brothers who knew the desert like the back of their hands. Their mission was not to fight, but to harass. They would become phantoms, striking at Dalton's patrols and supply lines. They would appear on a ridge, fire a few long-range shots to sow confusion, and then vanish into the canyons before the outlaws could even react. They would start small fires, create rock slides, and leave behind signs of a much larger force, set tracks of a dozen horses where there were only two. They were to be a constant, unnerving nuisance, a thorn in the wolf's paw, designed to make him angry, frustrated, and careless. The men of Sagebrush, accustomed to direct, brutal action, were initially skeptical of Maggie's womanly tactics. But as the days passed, they began to see the genius in her strategy. The phantom raids were working. Reports came in of Dalton's patrols returning to their camp spooked and empty-handed. The town, once a collection of isolated, vulnerable buildings, now felt like a unified, defensible whole. Maggie, in the meantime, proved to be more than just a strategist. She was a natural leader. She moved through the town with a tireless energy, her presence a constant source of reassurance. She spoke with the women, organizing them to stockpile food, water, and medical supplies. She learned the name of every man in her militia, listening to their fears and bolstering their courage. She was not a commander who shouted orders from on high. She was a leader who walked among her people, her calm confidence a shield against their despair. The chessboard was set. The pieces were in motion. Maggie Fallon had refused to be a pawn in a man's world. She had become a queen, and she was maneuvering for a checkmate that would be decided not by the force of arms, but by the power of a superior mind. Black Wolf Dalton was not accustomed to being annoyed. He was accustomed to being feared. His campaign against Sagebrush, which should have been a simple matter of terrorizing the populace into submission, had taken a strange and irritating turn. His scouts brought him confusing reports. The town seemed to be emptying out, a sure sign of a breaking will. Yet the people who remained were fortifying the buildings with an unexpected level of sophistication. Worse, his own patrols, the wolves who were meant to be the hunters, were now being hunted. "It's like chasing ghosts," one of his lieutenants, a grizzled outlaw named Silas, complained, nursing a whiskey in their main camp, a sprawling, messy collection of tents in a hidden box canyon. "To men, they say. They fire from the rocks a mile away, and then they're just gone. They left tracks for 20 horses near the South Pass. We followed it for half a day. It was just 2 horses, walking in circles." Dalton, a tall, charismatic man with cold, intelligent eyes, listened to these reports with a growing sense of frustration. He was being toyed with. This was not the work of a panicked, dithering town council. This was the work of a single, clever mind. His scouts had reported that the one orchestrating the town's defense was not the sheriff or the judge, but a woman. The Fallon girl, who had inherited the big ranch. He had initially dismissed this as nonsense. Now, he wasn't so sure. The thought that a woman was outmaneuvering him was both infuriating and intriguing. He decided it was time to test the town's defenses, to make a show of force that would shatter their fragile, newfound courage. He would not lead a full-scale assault, not yet. He would lead a surgical strike, or raid designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. His target, the church. It was the town's symbol of hope and community. He would burn it to the ground, in broad daylight, as a message to whoever was pulling the strings. Maggie, however, anticipated his move. She had spent hours studying Dalton's past raids, the chess master studying her opponent's previous games. Dalton had a flair for the dramatic, a love of symbolism. He didn't just kill, he made statements. The church was the most logical and symbolic target. The day of the raid, Maggie was ready. She had moved the women and children to the fortified redoubt in the canyon. The town itself was a quiet, baited trap. The streets were empty. The windows were shuttered. It looked like a town cowering in fear. Dalton and a dozen of his best riders rode into sagebrush at high noon. They moved with an arrogant confidence, their guns drawn, expecting no resistance. The silence of the town pleased Dalton. It was the silence of terror, the silence of a beaten dog. They rode directly to the church at the end of the main street. "Burn it," Dalton ordered, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Two of his men dismounted, carrying torches. As they approached the church steps, a single rifle shot cracked from the second-story window of the hotel. The shot was not aimed to kill. It was a signal. The bullet splintered the wooden cross atop the church's steeple, a deliberate, theatrical act of defiance. Before the outlaws could react, the town erupted. Not in a panicked, disorganized volley, but in a coordinated, disciplined crossfire. From the fortified windows of the hotel on one side of the street and the mercantile on the other, a dozen rifles opened up. The main street, which had seemed like an open road, became a deadly channel of fire. The outlaws were caught completely exposed. Horses screamed and fell. Riders were knocked from their saddles. Dalton, his face a mask of shocked fury, roared at his men to take cover. But there was no cover. The street was a killing floor. Maggie was not on the front lines. She was directing the battle from a third-story window in the saloon, using a system of colored flags to give commands to her rifle teams. She had turned the battle into a chess problem, and she was controlling the board. She had deliberately allowed Dalton to ride deep into the town, and now she had sprung the trap. Dalton, realizing he had been brilliantly outmaneuvered, made a tactical decision. He roared the order to retreat. The surviving outlaws, firing wildly behind them, spurred their horses and galloped back out of the town, dragging their wounded with them. They left behind for dead men and a half-dozen dead horses in the street. The gunfight was over in less than 5 minutes. The town of Sagebrush had not only resisted, it had won a stunning, decisive victory. As the smoke cleared, the men of Maggie's militia emerged from the buildings, their faces a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. They had faced the wolf pack and had not only survived, but had drawn blood. Maggie came down to the street, her face calm, but her heart pounding with the adrenaline of the fight. The men gathered around her, no longer seeing a girl, but a brilliant and fearless commander. Judge Miller and the other members of the town council watched from the doorway of the saloon, their faces pale with a mixture of shock and a dawning, grudging respect. Maggie had made her first move. She had met Dalton's show of force with a superior show of strategy. She had proven that the lioness had claws. But as she looked at the bodies of the dead outlaws, she felt no triumph. She knew this was just the opening gambit. The wolf had been wounded, and a wounded wolf was the most dangerous beast of all. The victory in the street was a potent tonic for the spirit of Sagebrush. The fear that had paralyzed the town was replaced by a surge of defiant pride. Maggie Fallon was no longer an anomaly. She was a hero, her name spoken with a new and profound respect. The men of her militia, who had once been skeptical, now followed her orders with a quiet, unwavering loyalty. But Maggie knew that pride was a dangerous luxury. They had won a battle, not the war. Dalton was wounded, his arrogance shattered, and he would return with a vengeance that would make the first raid look like a church social. The town's immediate problem was internal. The victory had exposed the utter incompetence of Judge Miller and the old guard of the town council. They had become figures of ridicule, their blustering authority now seen for the hollow thing it was. But they still held the official power. They controlled the town's legal structure and, more importantly, its finances. And they were not about to cede that power to a 22-year-old woman, no matter how brilliant she was. An uneasy and undeclared civil war began to simmer in Sagebrush. Miller and his cronies, their pride wounded, began a campaign of obstruction. They refused to release town funds for more ammunition. They spread rumors that Maggie's reckless tactics were inviting an annihilation. They tried to reassert their authority, holding public meetings where they spoke of negotiating a truce with Dalton, a euphemism for a complete and total surrender. Maggie found herself fighting a war on two fronts, against the wolf at the door, and against the snakes in her own house. This was a different kind of battle, one not of strategy and crossfires, but of politics and psychology. It was a chess game where the pieces were people's loyalties, fears, and prejudices. She realized she could not win this fight alone. She needed an ally, someone from within the old guard who could bridge the gap between her new, popular authority and the town's established power structure. Her choice was a surprising one: Sheriff Brody. The sheriff had been a marginal figure in the conflict, a man caught between his duty and his deep-seated sense of inadequacy. He had watched Maggie's rise with a mixture of awe and shame. She was doing the job he was supposed to be doing, and she was doing it with a courage he had long since lost. Maggie approached him not in his office, the seat of his official power, but in the quiet of the evening, as he was making his lonely rounds. She didn't come to him as a commander, but as a confidant. "Sheriff," she began, her voice gentle, "this town is tearing itself in two. Judge Miller is willing to sacrifice every soul in Sagebrush to protect his own pride." "I know," Brody said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But he's the head of the council. He controls the funds. My hands are tied." "Are they?" Maggie asked, her green eyes searching his. "You wear the star, Sheriff. That star doesn't represent Judge Miller. It represents the law. It represents the safety of these people. My father always said that a man's real authority doesn't come from a title. It comes from the respect he earns. These people, they respect you, but they're losing faith, because they see you letting a fool lead them to the slaughter." Her words were a subtle, powerful challenge. She wasn't accusing him of cowardice, she was reminding him of his own forgotten strength. She was appealing to the man he used to be. "What do you want from me, Maggie?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. "I need you to be the sheriff," she said simply. "I can lead the fight. I can plan the strategy. But I need you to be the voice of the law. I need you to stand with me, to give what we are doing the weight of legal authority. I need you to deputize my militia. I need you to sign the order that releases the town's funds for our defense, an order that would be legal under the Territorial Emergency Charter. Judge Miller is a politician. He will not stand against the will of the people and the letter of the law, combined." She was offering him a partnership, a way to reclaim his own self-respect. She was giving him a chance to be the hero he had long since given up on being. Sheriff Brody stood in the dusty street for a long time, the weight of his star suddenly feeling very heavy again. He looked at this young woman, at her fierce intelligence and her unwavering resolve, and he made a decision. He would not spend the rest of his life as a relic, a man who had stood by and done nothing. The next day, a notice, handwritten and signed by Sheriff Brody, was nailed to the door of the saloon. It officially deputized every member of Maggie's militia under the Territorial Emergency Act. A second notice, delivered to Silas Croft at the bank, was a legally binding order to release funds for the common defense of the township of Sagebrush. When Judge Miller saw the notices, he was apoplectic. He stormed into the sheriff's office, his face purple with rage, and found Brody sitting behind his desk, cleaning his old service revolver, his movements calm and deliberate. "What is the meaning of this, Brody?" the judge roared. Sheriff Brody looked up, his eyes clear and steady for the first time in years. "It means," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "that I am the duly appointed sheriff of this town, and I am doing my job." The meeting is adjourned, Judge. The balance of power had shifted. The alliance between Maggie's strategic genius and the sheriff's legal authority was a force that the old guard could not defeat. Maggie had won the internal war without firing a shot. Now, she could turn her full attention to the external one. And she would need to, because she knew the wolf was gathering his pack for the final, decisive hunt. The public alliance between Maggie Fallon and Sheriff Brody was a seismic event in the life of Sagebrush. It was a formal, undeniable transfer of power. Judge Miller and his cronies, outmaneuvered and publicly marginalized, retreated into a state of sullen, impotent fury. They could no longer obstruct. They could only watch as Maggie, now with the full legal and financial backing of the township, transformed Sagebrush into a disciplined, well-prepared fortress. The victory, however, brought with it a new and unnerving reality: the silence. After the humiliating defeat of his daylight raid, Black Wolf Dalton and his pack seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. The phantom raids on his patrols ceased, because the patrols themselves had disappeared. The nightly sentinels on the mesas were gone. The territory fell into a deep, profound, and terrifying quiet. This silence was not a sign of peace. It was the calm before a hurricane. It was the nerving stillness of a predator gathering its strength, studying its prey, and preparing for the final, killing blow. This period of quiet was, in many ways, more difficult for the town than the open conflict had been. The adrenaline of the first victory faded, replaced by the gnawing, corrosive acid of suspense. Every dawn was a question, every sunset a reprieve. The men of the newly deputized militia, who had been heroes in the heat of battle, now grew restless and anxious. They stood their watches on the rooftops, staring out at the vast, empty desert, their imaginations populating the heat haze with phantom armies. The waiting was a war of nerves, a siege of the soul, and it was Maggie's most challenging test of leadership yet. She understood that Dalton was deliberately trying to break their spirit, to let their fear and impatience do his work for him. He was waiting for their discipline to fray, for their unity to crack under the strain. Maggie countered this psychological warfare with a campaign of her own, one aimed at maintaining morale and purpose. She did not allow the town to sit and wait for the axe to fall. She put them to work. Under her direction, Sagebrush became a hive of disciplined activity. She organized drills for the militia, running them through tactical exercises, honing their skills until the coordinated defense they had used in the first raid became second nature. This was not just for practical readiness, it was to keep the men focused, to give them a sense of control over their own destiny, and to combat the idleness that bred fear. She had them expand the network of tunnels and passages between the buildings until it was possible to move from one end of town to the other completely unseen. She also focused on logistics. She sent out heavily guarded scouting parties, not to engage Dalton, but to hunt, bringing back deer and antelope to supplement their dwindling food supplies. She took inventory of every bullet, every bag of flour, every medical supply in the town, rationing them with a fair but firm hand. Her leadership was a constant, reassuring presence. She was everywhere at once, helping Doc Miller organize a makeshift infirmary, discussing fortification plans with Ben Carter, and spending time with the families hidden in the redoubt, reading to the children and bolstering the spirits of their mothers. It was during this long silence that her relationship with Sheriff Brody deepened into a true partnership. The tired, defeated man she had challenged had been reborn. He found in Maggie a strategic mind he could respect, and she found in him a deep well of practical, hard-won knowledge about the nature of outlaws and the grim realities of frontier justice. They would spend long evenings in his office, poring over maps, discussing Dalton's possible strategies, their conversation a comfortable and efficient exchange between two professionals. "He's not a common thug," Maggie, Rudy said one night, his finger tracing a line on the map that marked a series of old, forgotten mining trails. "A common thug would have come back by now, blind with rage. He's a general. He's waiting for us to make a mistake. He's looking for a weakness, a way around our defenses." "Then we can't have any weaknesses," Maggie replied, her expression determined. "And we can't make any mistakes." But the strain was beginning to show on the town. A few families, unable to bear the suspense, packed their wagons in the middle of the night and slipped away, choosing the uncertainty of the open desert over the certainty of the coming battle. Fights broke out in the saloon over petty disputes, the men's frayed nerves snapping at the slightest provocation. Maggie knew she was in a race against time. She had to hold the town together long enough to survive the storm she knew was coming. Her greatest fear was that Dalton's silence meant he was no longer focused on the town itself, but on its lifeline. The town was an island, and its survival depended on the ranches that supplied it. She sent writers to the other major ranchers in the Riemann who had initially scoffed at her leadership with a simple, urgent message: "We must stand together." or we will hang separately. She proposed a mutual defense pact, an alliance that would pool their resources and manpower. Some, their pride still stinging, refused. But others, their fear outweighing their prejudice, agreed. A fragile, but vital, alliance began to form, a network of ranches united under Maggie's unofficial command. The long silence was a crucible. It was forging the disparate, frightened individuals of Sagebrush into a true community, a hardened, resilient entity. But it was also stretching their courage to its absolute breaking point. Maggie felt the weight of every soul in the valley on her shoulders. She was the queen on the chessboard, and she knew that her opponent, the Black Wolf, was about to make his final, devastating move. The waiting was almost over. The silence broke not with the thunder of hooves, but with the subtlety of a chess master executing a brilliant, unexpected move. Black Wolf Dalton, having used the long quiet to study the board, launched a gambit designed not to overwhelm Sagebrush, but to draw its protector out into the open and break the alliance she had so carefully constructed. His target was not the town, nor was it Maggie's well-defended Crossstaff Ranch. It was the Double Horn, a ranch owned by an old, stubborn cattleman named Jebediah Kane. Kane was one of the ranchers who, out of sheer pride and a deep-seated distrust of a woman's leadership, had refused to join Maggie's mutual defense pact. His ranch was large, prosperous, and, Maggie knew, strategically isolated. It was the weakest piece on the board. Dalton didn't lead a raid. He laid a siege. He sent a portion of his force, perhaps 15 riders, to surround the Double Horn. They didn't attack. They simply cut it off. They dammed its water supply, shot any rider who tried to get in or out, and began to systematically run off Kane's cattle from his outlying pastures. It was a slow, methodical strangulation, a public and brutal demonstration of what happened to those who did not stand with the rest of the valley. The news was brought to Sagebrush by Kane's teenage son, who had managed to slip through the cordon at night, his horse nearly run to death. He stumbled into the sheriff's office, his face pale with terror and exhaustion, and gasped out the story. The news sent a shockwave of panic and indecision through the town. A meeting was immediately convened. The room was a cacophony of conflicting opinions. Judge Miller and his faction saw it as an "I told you so" moment. "This is what comes of her provocations," the judge declared. Kane was a neutral party. "Now Dalton is making an example of him. We must negotiate." Others, more hot-blooded, argued for an immediate, full-scale rescue mission. "We can't let them slaughter the Kanes," a young rancher shouted. "We have to ride out there now." Maggie stood at the front of the room, listening to the arguments, her face a calm, thoughtful mask. She understood Dalton's gambit perfectly. It was brilliant in its cruelty. He had created an impossible dilemma for her. If she did nothing, her alliance would crumble. The other ranchers would see that her promises of mutual defense were hollow, and they would rush to make their own desperate deals with Dalton. Her authority, her entire strategy, would be shattered. The town would be isolated and doomed. But if she led her militia out to the Double Horn, she would be walking directly into a trap. She would be abandoning the fortified town, splitting her forces, and marching across open country to face an enemy of unknown numbers on ground of his choosing. Dalton would be waiting. He would annihilate her militia in the open, and then the defenseless town of Sagebrush would be his for the taking. It was a classic checkmate scenario. She was damned if she did, and damned if she didn't. She let the arguments rage for a full 10 minutes, her mind working furiously, analyzing the board, searching for a third move, a move her opponent had not anticipated. Finally, she held up a hand, and a reluctant silence fell over the room. "We will not do nothing," she said, her voice clear and firm, "and we will not ride into a trap. A queen does not abandon her castle to save a single pawn, especially when she knows the enemy king is waiting to take her. But a good queen finds a way to move another piece to change the entire game." She turned to Sheriff Brody. "Sheriff, I need you to lead a diversion. Take a dozen of our best riders. Ride north, toward the old mining trails. Make a show of it. Let Dalton's scouts see you. He will assume it's our main rescue force, and he will move his reserves to intercept you. It will be a feint, a ghost army to draw his attention." She then turned to the assembled men. "The rest of us," she said, her green eyes blazing with a daring light, "are going hunting. But we are not hunting the wolves at the Double Horn. We are going to find Dalton's own den. We are going to find his camp. Her plan was met with stunned silence. It was an act of almost unimaginable audacity. While Dalton's attention was focused on the siege at the Cane Ranch and the diversionary force to the north, she intended to lead a small, elite strike team on a desperate, high-risk mission to find and attack the wolf pack's main encampment. "It's suicide," Judge Miller sputtered. "You have no idea where it is." "No," Maggie corrected him, a small, grim smile on her lips. "But I have a pretty good idea. For months, his pack has been supplied from somewhere. They need water, food, ammunition. And for the past week, I've had my best to scouts brothers who have been his ghosts doing nothing but tracking his supply wagons. They've been following them from a distance, marking their path. And last night, they brought me this." She unrolled a piece of buckskin on the table. On it was a crudely drawn map, marking a series of hidden canyons and water holes, and a single, final destination, a place known as Scorpion Draw. A box canyon that was accessible by only one narrow, easily defensible pass. "While Dalton is playing chess with us at the Cane Ranch," Maggie said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper, "we are going to sneak into his castle from the back door and steal his crown. We will not engage his main force. We will hit his supplies. We will burn his wagons, run off his horses, and destroy his ammunition. We will cripple him. We will take away his ability to wage this war." It was a gambit of her own, a move of such daring and unexpectedness that it left the room breathless. She was not just reacting to Dalton's move, she was escalating the conflict, raising the stakes to their absolute limit. It was a move that would either win the war in a single, brilliant stroke, or get them all killed. The lioness was tired of defending her territory. She was going into the wolf's own den to rip out his heart. The success of Maggie's audacious plan depended on speed, stealth, and perfect execution. She chose her strike team with care, a small group of 6, including herself. It comprised the 2 weary scout brothers, whose knowledge of the desert was unparalleled, Ben Carter, the blacksmith, whose brute strength and quiet courage were unshakable, and 2 other veteran ranchers who were crack shots and moved through the wilderness with the silence of ghosts. Sheriff Brody, after a long argument, had agreed to lead the larger diversionary force to the north, his pride warring with his better judgment, but his loyalty to Maggie winning out. They rode out from sagebrush under the cover of darkness, not as a posse, but as individual riders, melting into the landscape to avoid any watching eyes. They carried no excess gear, only their weapons, water, and grim determination. The journey to Scorpion Draw was a tense, grueling, 24-hour ordeal. They moved through a brutal and forgiving landscape of jagged rock and thorny scrub, a world away from the familiar plains around sagebrush. They spoke only in whispers, their communication a series of hand signals perfected during their long weeks of drilling. They reached the ridge overlooking Scorpion Draw just as the moon was rising on the second night. The sight below them was both daunting and validating. It was the heart of the wolf pack's operation. The box canyon was a sprawling, chaotic camp, dotted with at least 24 campfires. A large herd of horses, the lifeblood of any outlaw gang, was penned in a makeshift corral. A line of heavy supply wagons was parked near the canyon's only entrance. The number of men was far greater than Maggie had anticipated. There had to be at least 25 or 30 outlaws in the camp, a reserve force that Dalton had kept hidden. Her scouts had been right. This was the den. Maggie and her team spent an hour observing, their minds working as one, planning their attack. Their targets were threefold: the horse herd, the supply wagons, and, most importantly, the large, central tent that was obviously Dalton's headquarters and likely contained the bulk of his ammunition and explosives. A direct assault was impossible. They would have to be ghosts, creating chaos, and then vanishing before the enemy could mount an effective response. They descended from the ridge like shadows, leaving their horses behind. The 2 scout brothers, armed only with knives and silent garrots, moved toward the 2 sentries guarding the narrow canyon entrance. The attack was swift, silent, and brutal. The 2 guards were eliminated before they could make a sound. With the entrance secured for their escape, the team split up. Ben Carter and one of the ranchers crept toward the horse corral, their goal to cut the ropes and stampede the herd, creating a massive diversion and robbing the gang of its mobility. The other rancher and the 2 scout brothers moved toward the supply wagons, armed with flasks of kerosene and matches. Maggie was left with the most dangerous task. Alone, she crept toward the center of the camp, her rifle held at the ready, her target the main tent. She moved with a patience and stealth that would have done an Apache proud, using the deep shadows cast by the canyon walls. The noise of the outlaws' drunken revelry covering the sound of her movements. She reached the back of the tent, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear voices from inside Eddleton's lieutenants, planning the final assault on Sagebrush. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had brought with her a small, custom-made package from Ben Carter's forge, a bundle of dynamite sticks with a single, long, slow-burning fuse. She carefully placed the charge at the base of the tent pole, tucked behind a stack of supply crates. She lit the fuse. It caught, sputtering to life, a tiny, deadly spark in the darkness. She had estimated it would give her 10 minutes. She gave a soft, prearranged signal, the call of a screech owl, which was answered almost immediately from the darkness. As she melted back into the shadows, all hell broke loose. Ben Carter's axe severed the thick ropes of the corral. With wild yells and a few strategically thrown rocks, he and his partner spooked the herd. 100 terrified horses surged out of the corral, a thundering, unstoppable stampede that crashed through the center of the camp, trampling tents, scattering campfires, and sowing utter, blind panic. At the same moment, the supply wagons at the canyon entrance burst into flame, the kerosene-soaked canvas and wood turning them into roaring infernos that blocked the main escape route. The outlaws, startled from their drunken stupor, stumbled from their tents into a nightmare of fire, smoke, and thundering hoofs. They were confused, disorganized, firing their pistols wildly at shadows. And then, Maggie's charge detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. Dalton's tent vanished in a blinding flash and a deafening roar, taking with it the gang's entire supply of ammunition and explosives. A secondary explosion from the ammunition crates sent a deadly shower of shrapnel and bullets tearing through the camp. In the ensuing chaos, Maggie and her team retreated, firing as they went, not to kill, but to add to the confusion. They reached the canyon entrance, mounted their horses, and galloped into the desert night, leaving behind them a scene of utter devastation. They had not killed Black Wolf Dalton, but they had done something far worse. They had ripped out the heart of his operation. They had destroyed his supplies, scattered his horses, and shattered the morale of his men. The lioness had walked into the wolf's own den, and had burned it to the ground. The final confrontation was now inevitable, but it would be on her terms, not his. The ride back to Sagebrush was a tense, exhilarating blur. Maggie and her strike team pushed their horses to the limit, knowing that Dalton, and his incandescent rage, would be coming for them, and for the town, with everything he had left. They arrived at dawn, exhausted, smoke-stained, but victorious, to the stunned and jubilant townspeople. The news of their success, of the crippling blow they had dealt to the wolf pack, was a jolt of pure adrenaline to the community's heart. But Maggie knew this was no time for celebration. It was a time for preparation. "He's coming," she told Sheriff Brody and the assembled militia, her voice grim. "This isn't about land or money anymore. This is about revenge. He's wounded, and he's going to be insane with rage. He'll throw everything he has at us. This will be the final battle." Dalton, for his part, was a man transformed. The charismatic, calculating strategist had been consumed by a creature of pure, primal fury. His camp was a smoking ruin. His supplies were gone. Half his horses were scattered across the desert. His men were terrified, their confidence shattered, many of them deserting into the night. But he had managed to rally a core group of his most loyal, most brutal killers, perhaps 15 men, all of them now animated by his own insane desire for vengeance. He had one asset left, his intimate knowledge of the territory, and a secret that not even Maggie's scouts could have known. He did not ride for the main trail to Sagebrush. He led his men on a punishing, circuitous route through the Badlands toward an old, abandoned silver mine known as the Widowmaker. The mine's main shaft, long thought to have collapsed, had a secondary air vent that, according to old prospectors' maps, emerged in the cellar of the old Asia building that stood right in the center of Sagebrush, directly behind the sheriff's office. While the town prepared for a frontal assault, fortifying the barricades at either end of the main street. Dalton was preparing to rise up from the ground in their very midst. It was a desperate, brilliant, and utterly mad plan, the final, vicious move of a cornered king. The attack came not at dawn, as expected, but in the dead of the following night, under the cover of a raging thunderstorm. The wind howled, the rain lashed down, and the thunder cracked, masking any sound. As the sentries on the rooftops huddled against the storm, their visibility reduced to near zero, Dalton and his men emerged from the cellar of the SE office. They were like demons crawling up from the earth, their faces set in grim, murderous lines. Their first target was the town's command structure. They moved with a deadly, silent efficiency, slitting the throat of the lone deputy guarding the back of the sheriff's office. They stormed the building, capturing a stunned and sleepy Sheriff Brody before he could even reach for his gun. Their second move was to create a catastrophic diversion. They set fire to the hotel and the mercantile simultaneously, the flames, fanned by the storm winds, spreading with terrifying speed. Maggie was in her father's old office at the Cross Ranch on the edge of town, reviewing defense plans with Ben Carter, when the church bell began to ring in a frantic, panicked alarm. Looking toward the town, she saw the impossible. Sagebrush was on fire not from the outside, but from within. She knew, with a sickening, cold certainty, what had happened. She had been outmaneuvered. The wolf was inside the sheepfold. "Ben," she said, her voice a deadly calm, "get the men. We ride. Now." She and her militia galloped into a town that had become a vision of hell. The storm, the fires, the panicked screams of the few townspeople who had remained, all created a scene of utter chaos. Dalton's men were moving through the streets, not as a disciplined force, but as a rabid pack, shooting at anything that moved. And then she saw him. In the center of the street, illuminated by the flames of the burning hotel, Black Wolf Dalton stood, a pistol in each hand. In front of him, on his knees, was Sheriff Brody, his hands bound, a gun to his head. "Maggie Fallon," Dalton's voice roared over the storm, a sound of triumphant madness. "You wanted a war. You have won. Now, you will watch your town, and your lawmen, die. This is the price of defying me." It was the ultimate checkmate. Her town was burning. Her friend and ally was a hostage. Her militia was caught in a chaotic street fight. Dalton had turned her own strategy against her, creating a situation where any move she made would be the wrong one. She stood in the pouring rain, her rifle in her hand, facing the man who had become her nemesis, the devil himself, holding all the cards. The scene in the main street of Sagebrush was a tableau from a nightmare. The fire raged, the rain hissed, and in the center of it all was a standoff born of pure hatred. Maggie looked at Sheriff Brody, kneeling in the mud, his face stoic and unafraid. She looked at Dalton, his face a mask of insane glee, his eyes glittering in the firelight. And she knew this was not a battle that could be won with strategy. The chessboard had been kicked over. This was a primal, final confrontation, and it would be decided by will alone. "Let him go, Dalton," she yelled, her voice cutting through the roar of the storm. "Your fight is with me. My fight is with everyone," he screamed back, his voice cracking. "You took everything from me. I'm going to take everything from you." Starting with him, he pressed the gun harder against the sheriff's temple. In that moment, Maggie saw a flicker of movement from a second-story window of the saloon, just behind Dalton. It was Sarah, the schoolteacher, a woman she had thought was safely in the redoubt. But Sarah had refused to be a bystander. She held her husband's old, heavy buffalo rifle, its long barrel resting on the windowsill. Her face was a pale, determined oval in the darkness. She caught Maggie's eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Maggie understood. A new, desperate plan formed in her mind, a gambit that relied on perfect timing and absolute trust. She had one chance. "All right, Dalton," she shouted, taking a deliberate step forward into the firelight, making herself a clear target. "You win. It's me you want. Let the sheriff go, and I'm yours. My ranch, the town, it's all yours. Just let him go." Dalton hesitated, his mad eyes narrowing. Her surrender was what he had wanted, but the completeness of it, the suddenness, made him suspicious. It was in that moment of hesitation that Sheriff Brody acted. He was not a young man, but he was a brave one. With a final, defiant roar, he lunged sideways, throwing himself at Dalton's legs, a desperate, suicidal attempt to spoil his aim and give Maggie a chance. The world exploded into motion. Dalton, thrown off balance, fired his pistol, the shot going wild, striking the mud next to Brody's head. As he struggled to regain his footing, Maggie raised her own rifle. But she did not fire at Dalton. She fired at the large wooden sign of the saloon, which hung directly above his head. The heavy .44 caliber slug shattered the thick iron chain holding one side of the sign. At the exact same moment, another, heavier shot boomed from the saloon window. Sarah, the schoolteacher, fired her buffalo rifle, the powerful slug splintering the other chain. The massive, heavy wooden sign, freed from its moorings, swung down like a guillotine. Dalton, his attention on the lunging sheriff and the woman in the street, looked up a fraction of a second too late, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. The sign crashed down on him, crushing him to the ground with a sickening, final thud. The death of their leader, so sudden and so absolute, broke the will of the remaining outlaws. Seeing their devil vanquished, they were no longer a wolf pack, they were just a collection of frightened, cornered men. Maggie's militia, recovering from their initial shock, closed in, and the fight turned into a rout. Some surrendered, throwing down their guns. Others tried to flee, only to be cut down. As the storm began to subside and the fires were slowly brought under control, an exhausted, battered, but victorious town emerged from the chaos. Maggie rushed to Sheriff Brody, helping the old lawman to his feet. He was bruised and shaken, but alive. "You were a damn fool, Sheriff," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," he replied, a slow, weary grin spreading across his face. "Felt good." Maggie looked at the body of her vanquished enemy, then at the town she had saved. It was scarred, wounded, but it was still standing, and it was free. She looked up at the saloon window, where Sarah was being helped away by the other women, her part in the final battle played. In the days that followed, Sagebrush began to rebuild. But it was not the same town. The old, rigid patriarchy had been burned away in the fires of the final battle. A new town council was formed, and its first, unanimous act was to elect a new leader, a person who had earned the position not through birth or wealth, but through courage, intelligence, and an unbreakable will. Maggie Fallon stood on the steps of the newly built town hall, the deeds to her ranch in one hand and the town charter in the other. She was no longer an anomaly, a girl playing a man's game. She was a founder, a leader, a protector. The men of the town looked at her not with prejudice or fear, but with a profound and abiding respect. She had taught them that strength was not a matter of gender, but of character, and that the roar of a lioness, once unleashed, could shake the very foundations of the West. The fire of freedom and justice had been lit, and its keeper was the indomitable woman of Sagebrush.